Good morning, Sunday the 10th of January in 2021, and 10 days ago we just quite arbitrarily moved around the sun in a particular way. The earth has been doing that all of its life, and we passed through a date we've chosen that decided that a year had ended and a year had begun. And we measure our life in those chunks in all kinds of ways, but in the chunks of a year. And of course 2020 was quite a year, and 2021 has started well, not quite in the way many of us had hoped, I'm sure. Beginnings. It's all about beginnings. And on the 1st of January, people have traditionally made resolutions. They've thought at the end of last year what they'd like to be different. Some of you might be taking part in dry January, drinking no alcohol for a month for whatever reasons, mostly health reasons often. We do all kinds of things that mark beginnings for us. Mark the passage of time. Mark decisions we make, mark parts of our identity in some ways. And our readings this morning in the New Testament are very much about the beginning of the ministry of Jesus and what it means not just for him but for those who've come on after him. Because we're in Mark's Gospel right at the very beginning, and Mark doesn't mess around with the nativity. There's no Christmas story in Mark's Gospel. There is just the beginning of Jesus beginning his earthly ministry. That's what happens at the start of the book. And so in the 4th verse of the 1st chapter, we have Jesus coming to John the Baptist in the desert and being baptized. And after his baptism, as he comes up out the water, the heavens open, the dove descends, and a voice is heard saying, "This is my son, in whom I'm well pleased, my beloved. Listen to him," depending on how it's translated, words like that. Baptism is important. It's been a subject of much debate and disagreement and name-calling in the church for a long time, because we can't agree on not so much just what it means, but when it's most appropriate in someone's life. So many churches baptize infants. Lots of churches don't. They say that baptism is, in the New Testament, part of our response to God, not something that we receive first and then respond to later. For many of us, it's about grace and about what that might symbolize. But whatever we make of it, baptism is a beginning in some ways. It's a marking of a moment in a child's life or an adult's life. The proclamation, the statement together in community with others that there is something to be said about this child or this person's life. And whether they are saying it themselves or we're saying it with them and for them, something's being said. Something is potentially being unlocked. Something is beginning. I don't know about you, but I've struggled for a long time with the idea of baptism primarily or solely being about the cleansing of our sins. That somehow as infants or as adults, whoever we are, before we get to that point where we are either sprinkled with water or ducked under water or somehow baptized in a legitimate context, that somehow we are outside of God's love. Even just in part, that we aren't quite yet as much part of God's heart as we will be once that water has been sprinkled or we've been dunked. I struggle with that because I don't like what it says about God. It makes God's love quite arbitrary in some ways, that until this particular things happened with this with water, that somehow, I don't know, it doesn't hold to the truth that God is love. But it is an important beginning. And I know for myself, I was baptized as an infant, so I didn't get the chance as an adult to have that response. But I've been to quite a few adult baptisms, both in the UK and in South Africa, and they're very powerful things. Because for the person who is undergoing that ritual, immersing in water, this is a profound memory being shaped of a very deliberate decision to orientate their lives in the direction of following Jesus. And that is a beautiful thing. A beautiful thing. So what do we make of the passage of Jesus being baptized? Well, some people say that this is about Jesus being in solidarity with us. Jesus doesn't need cleansing from sin, but Jesus needs to show that God is completely identifying with all that human life means and encompasses. And so Jesus comes to John to fulfill the line of prophecy that has Jesus take that to a whole new level by the end of the reading, with the heavens opening and God proclaiming something particular about Jesus. It could mean all kinds of things. But it is not just a beginning. It's not just a moment in itself. And the danger is that sometimes we think of things like baptism in ways that are unhelpful. We tie them to words like being saved, as though this is something that happens in an instant, as though in a moment, because of something we say or do, God changes God's mind about us, and we are therefore in a different world afterwards. We're in a far more gracious and loving world. That there is a moment in which our relationship with God fundamentally changes. Again, I'm not sure about that, because I again don't like mostly what that says about God. But it is true that symbolic acts are powerful things. That the things we call sacraments in the Methodist Church, just baptism and Holy Communion, those are powerful things. And they're powerful things because there are things that we don't just think about or agree to. They're things we physically do. We do physical things that involve particular rituals in order to concretize, to cement, to make more real, I suppose, in those moments, the thing we're trying to express, to hold on to believe, to offer to each other. See, I have no beef with Roman Catholic brothers and sisters who expand those two sacraments into quite a few more. Ordination, marriage, they add others to those. Because in those moments as well, what we're doing often is we're creating a physical memory. Not just a memory based on an emotion or an impulse, but a physical memory of something we did, whether it was taking bread and drinking wine, whether it was bringing our child, gathering as a congregation to remember the moment where we looked at this child and we baptized them, whether it is about, for me, 20 years ago now, more than, people that I cherish, people that I looked up to, people who are my fathers and mothers in the faith, laying their hands on my head, feeling the weight of the hands on my head and my shoulders as I was ordained as a Methodist minister. That memory sustains me sometimes. It is the memory I go back to when I need to remember something of where I've come from, and when my ministry seems most opaque, because it is something that I'm feeling. That memory is a very particular physical memory of the weight of the loving hands of brothers and sisters who on behalf of many people counted me worthy and helped me know that for what I do. And no difference in marriage. In marriage we gather in a service of worship for people to say out loud powerful things, to put rings on each other's fingers if that's what they do, to bind hands, loose hands, to physically go through something that expresses a love that is already there and that they want to make permanent in a particular way. Our second reading today is in Acts chapter 19, where Paul, travelling through Corinth, arrives in Ephesus and finds some believers there, some apostles, and says to them, were you baptized? And they say, yes, we were. And then, in whose name were you baptized? Essentially, he says to them. I'll look at the passage again quickly. He says, into what were you then baptized? And they answer, into John's baptism. Paul said, John baptized with the baptism of repentance, telling people to believe in the one who was to come after, that is, in Jesus. And so on hearing this, they were baptized in the name of the Lord Jesus. Now what's interesting is what follows on. When Paul had laid his hands on them, the Holy Spirit came upon them, and they spoke in tongues and prophesied. Altogether, there were about 12 of them. And we jump on the speaking in tongues and prophesying in that passage, but that passage fills out our understanding of baptism, of this ritual, of all of the rituals in some ways that we use in the church that involve physical acts. Because I'm not sure that it's so much that until that moment the Holy Spirit was somewhere away, and then when they were baptized in the name of Jesus, suddenly the Holy Spirit came upon them. For me, that passage speaks of that thing we talk about in the Methodist Church, assurance, that somehow a baptism of repentance is about remembering the worst in ourselves and trying to be open and honest about that. But the baptism that is the baptism Paul offers in the story is about much more than that. It is about the whole invitation of God in the person of Jesus. Not just to look back on who we've been, but to ask who we are and where God is. And what they discover, those people. Maybe in the fact of being again ritually dunked under the water and the physical experience of the hands and the water and the going down and the coming up. Maybe somewhere in all of that, what comes home to them is something that is already there. The deep indwelling presence of God in the midst of their own lives, in their very bodies, experiencing the water and the baptism. So often in the church we get hung up on the details, and these passages become passages we debate and argue over. They become competitive, as though our understanding of what baptism means and how it's appropriate and rightly offered and given and received, and what it means to receive the Holy Spirit, what it means to perhaps pray in tongues and prophesy, whatever those mean to you and I, that we debate around those things, which are really on the edges of this passage, I think, and the gospel passage too. Those things are on the edges, and they're a really clever way of avoiding the central truth. God comes into our lives in the person of Jesus. God radically identifies with all of human experience in his baptism in the gospel. God asks us in the language that John uses to set up what comes after in the first of the gospels written down. God lays out a story of love and of shared kingdom building. A God who is accessible, a God who is open, a God who is radically social, a God who is not particularly religious in the way that so much of Jewish history has portrayed the worship of God. A God who isn't actually that bothered about being worshipped in the way that we would understand that. A God who asks where power lies and how it's expressed and what generosity looks like and what love fundamentally can be in the world as a force for good that is effortful and costly and wonderful. And that there is a great discovery to be made in the course of that. That God is not somehow just alongside us, fighting the good fight, if that's the language we want to use, or, beavering away with us at all the things that we think are the doing good that we should do in the world. God is not just somehow in our buildings receiving our worship when we gather on Sundays or at other times. God lives in you and I. And if baptism is anything, then surely it is for an infant the proclamation that this child is of God and has God's love completely already. And if it is for an adult, the great discovery in their baptism that God has always been with them, God has always been in them, and God is continuing to do that. And what they create, what we create in the use of the water and the words, is a particular kind of memory that is far more substantial than what we have if we are simply left to our emotions. So I don't know if you've been baptized, if you remember your baptism. I almost said if you were around when you were baptized, you would have been there. But if you remember your baptism and what it might mean for you, what these passages mean for you. And that's again not a question about what you believe to be true about John's baptism and Jesus' baptism and praying in tongues and gift of the Holy Spirit. Not so much that. But do you have a deep sense of the indwelling of God? Do you have moments of decision marked by ritual, whether it was the church's or your own, whether it was throwing something away, casting a rock into the sea, whatever it might be? We use ritual all the time to mark moments in our lives. What are the rituals that have shaped your sense of self? And how do you remember them? And where is God in them for you as you remember them and as you live your life now? Which I guess is in part what Paul is saying to those who he encounters in Ephesus. What happened back then, and what does it mean for you now? What are your questions? And he helps them to know helps them to know that they're not just about repenting and behaving themselves. They are about the deep indwelling love of God. I hope you know that. I hope you feel that. Even if you don't today, I hope you know that you have felt it in trustworthy ways in the past, and that those memories sustain you because they are substantial memories. And where other people and rituals in the church or elsewhere, where those have helped you to make those memories a little more solid, celebrate that, cling to that, nurture those memories, let them sustain you, because we all need that, especially now. So bless you as you journey on into January 2021, this random arbitrary month that we've decided we would create as the earth goes round the sun. But as we mark this year, as we look back on last year, as we think about all the ways that we are marking our lives, let's ask where God is in that. And not just God outside of us speaking to us, but God deeply and richly inside of us, helping us to know God's language in our hearts. Bless you. Have a good Sunday.